Beneath the streets of Rome, archaeologists have identified burial sites connected to the earliest Christian communities in the city. The people buried there were not emperors or senators. They were missionaries, men and women who had walked into the heart of the empire knowing what Rome did to people like them. According to tradition, the men who started that movement, the 12 disciples of Jesus, died one by one in some of the most violent ways the ancient world recorded. This is the story of what happened to them, and why so much of it remains unresolved. The 12 disciples of Jesus are among the most recognized names in human history. Yet the moment Jesus disappears from the biblical narrative, so do they, almost entirely. The Acts of the Apostles follows a handful of them for a brief window. After that, the record goes quiet. What survives instead is a web of ancient traditions, church writings, and local memories scattered across 4 continents. From the fishing villages of Galilee to the trade ports of southwestern India. According to those traditions, the disciples did not settle quietly into old age. They traveled, they preached, they were arrested, beaten, stoned, crucified, and speared. And according to the overwhelming consensus of early Christian memory, only one of the 12 died in his own bed. The others were killed. But here is the problem that historians keep returning to. For most of them, the evidence is fragmentary, contested, or written centuries after the fact. Separating history from devotion, from legend, is one of the most difficult challenges in all of early Christian scholarship. So what do we actually know, and what has been passed down not because it is true, but because it needed to be? Before we follow the disciples across the ancient world, take a moment and subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel covers the buried history that rarely makes it into the textbooks. You will not want to miss what comes next. To understand what happened to the 12, we first have to understand what they actually were. Because the word disciple flattens something far more complex than it first appears. The word disciple comes from the Latin discipulus, meaning student. But that translation has always understated what these men actually were. The original Greek term used in the New Testament is mathits. It describes something closer to an apprentice, someone who does not simply receive instruction, but binds their entire life to the teacher's way. They traveled with Jesus. They ate with him. Several were given direct authority to act in his name. These were not passive observers sitting at the back of a lecture hall. They were the inner structure of an emerging movement. And then, one by one, the Bible stops mentioning them. The Acts of the Apostles follows Peter and Paul with reasonable consistency. But for most of the 12, Acts provides little more than a name. After the first few chapters, figures like Bartholomew, Simon the Zealot, and James the son of Alphaeus simply disappear from the text. No death recorded, no mission described, no final word. This is not a minor gap. These were the men entrusted with continuing everything. What fills that silence is not scripture. It is tradition, church writings, regional legends, and martyrdom accounts composed decades or centuries after the fact. Some carry the weight of genuine historical memory. Others are more difficult to verify. Historians continue to debate where the line between the two actually falls. What is not debated is the world these men were sent into. First-century Judea sat under Roman occupation, politically unstable and religiously fractured. Preaching a crucified Messiah was not a neutral act. It was, in many jurisdictions, a provocation. The crucifixion had scattered them. The resurrection traditions drew them back together. But followers and leaders are very different things. One man would have to become both and carry that weight all the way to Rome. His name was not Peter. That detail matters more than it first appears. The man history knows as the founder of the Roman Church was born Simon, a fisherman working the sea of Galilee with his brother Andrew. The name Peter came later, assigned by Jesus himself. Petros in Greek, Kepha in Aramaic. Both mean rock. Paul's letters, among the earliest documents in the New Testament, reference him as Cephas, the Aramaic form, suggesting this name was in active use within the first decades of the movement. It is one of the small details that anchors Peter as a genuine historical figure rather than a theological construct. But the rock had fractures. The Gospels record him sinking while attempting to walk on water, drawing a sword during Jesus' arrest and severing a soldier's ear, and then, hours later, denying 3 times that he knew Jesus at all. The denial is notable precisely because it was preserved. Early communities did not typically record the failures of their founding figures unless those failures were too widely known to suppress. After the resurrection, Peter emerges as the undisputed leader of the Jerusalem church. At Pentecost, Acts records him addressing a crowd of thousands. When the Roman centurion Cornelius sought baptism, it was Peter who set aside the requirement of Jewish law and admitted him anyway. A quiet decision that would permanently alter the boundaries of the faith. His path eventually leads to Rome. The historian Tacitus records Christian persecution under Nero following the Great Fire of 64 AD. Tradition, supported by early church writers including Clement and Ignatius, holds that Peter was arrested and executed, crucified upside down at his own request. The man who once denied Jesus died rather than deny him again. His death did not slow the movement, it accelerated it. But while Peter was building, another member of the 12 had already made a decision that none of them could undo. Every account of Judas was written by people who believed he had already damned himself. That is worth holding on to before anything else is said about him. His name in Hebrew, Yehuda, was one of the most common names in first-century Judea. He carried no obvious marks of suspicion among the 12. The Gospels record him as the group's treasurer, a position of trust. Whatever happened, it did not announce itself in advance. The betrayal is recorded across all 4 Gospels. 30 pieces of silver paid by the chief priests in exchange for information on Jesus' whereabouts. 30 pieces was roughly the price of a slave under Mosaic law, a detail Matthew appears to invoke deliberately, drawing on the book of Zechariah. But the question the Gospels never fully resolve is why. 3 separate explanations have circulated since antiquity. The first is greed, the most familiar reading, supported by John's characterization of Judas as a thief. The second is political disillusionment, the theory that Judas expected a messianic uprising and acted when none came. The third is theological, that he believed perhaps genuinely he was accelerating a divine plan. None of these can be confirmed, and that ambiguity has never fully closed. The accounts of his death introduce a further complication. Matthew records suicide by hanging. Acts describes a graphic death in a field purchased with the returned silver. The two accounts cannot be harmonized without considerable effort, and most scholars do not attempt it. Then, in 1978, a decomposed codex surfaced in Egypt. It passed through antiquities markets for decades before being identified as the Gospel of Judas, a 2nd century Gnostic text in which Judas is not a traitor but the only disciple who truly understood Jesus. It did not rewrite history, but it confirmed that early Christianity argued fiercely about who Judas actually was. The 12 were restored to their full number when Matthias was chosen to replace him. The structure held, but the mission ahead required more than structure. It required men willing to walk into territories no disciple had yet reached. One of them would travel further than any of the others, and the records of where he ended up continue to unsettle historians to this day. There is a Christian community in southern India that has existed by its own account since the 1st century AD. They do not trace their origins to Rome or to Constantinople or to any European missionary. They trace them to a single man who arrived by sea from the Middle East sometime around 52 AD. His name, they say, was Thomas. The Gospel of John records Thomas as the disciple who refused to accept the resurrection without physical proof. He is remembered for that doubt. What is less remembered is what tradition says he did next. By the 1st century AD, the Indian Ocean trade network was one of the most active commercial corridors in the ancient world. Roman merchants traveled regularly to the ports of southwestern India, following seasonal monsoon winds. The geography was known. The routes were established. A traveller from the Levant reaching the Kerala coast was not performing a miracle. It was simply a long journey. What is harder to explain is what was waiting there when historians began looking. The St. Thomas Christians of Kerala, known as the Nazrani, maintain liturgical traditions that predate any documented contact with Western Christianity. Their ancient rite draws from Syriac, the liturgical language of early Mesopotamian Christianity, not Latin. Early churches in the region contain inscriptions and architectural features consistent with pre-medieval origins. The community itself is not a later import. It was already old when Portuguese missionaries arrived in the 16th century and were startled to find it. Tradition holds that Thomas was speared to death near Milapore, in what is now the city of Chennai, and that a shrine was raised over his tomb. The Basilica of San Thome stands there today, and the site has drawn pilgrims continuously for centuries. Whether Thomas himself made that journey remains debated. What is not debated is that Christianity reached India very early, earlier than most. Western accounts of the faith's expansion typically acknowledge. That single fact quietly repositions the entire story. The movement was never only moving west. While Thomas was said to be pushing toward the edges of the known world, others were fanning out across Greece, Asia Minor, and North Africa. Within a single generation, the 12 had become something the Roman world had not anticipated: a network. Armenia became a Christian nation in 301 AD, more than a decade before Constantine legalized the faith inside the Roman Empire. That timing is rarely discussed. but it matters enormously. The tradition behind it traces directly to one of the 12. Bartholomew is one of the least documented disciples in the New Testament. His name appears in the apostolic lists and almost nowhere else. Yet Armenian Christian memory credits him alongside Thaddeus with first bringing the faith to the region. And the Armenian Apostolic Church, one of the oldest national churches on earth, treats that origin not as legend but as founding history. Andrew, meanwhile, is placed by early church traditions along the northern coast of the Black Sea and into Greece. The X-shaped cross, the crux dicasata, bears his name to this day, and his association with the city of Patras in the Peloponnese is referenced by writers as early as the 3rd century. In 2015, archaeologists excavating beneath the Church of the Holy Apostles in Thassos, Greece, uncovered early Christian burial structures consistent with 1st and 2nd century use. The site aligns with known Andrew traditions. Philip is connected by early sources to Hierapolis in Asia Minor, present-day Pamukkale in Turkey. Excavations there in 2011 uncovered a 1st century tomb complex that Turkish and Italian archaeologists identified as a strong candidate for Philip's burial site. The claim remains under scholarly review, but the structure itself is real and ancient. Matthew's traditions extend toward Ethiopia, though the historical record thins considerably at that distance. What survives is largely devotional. His more durable legacy is textual. The gospel attributed to him became the most cited of the 4 in early Christian writing. 4 men, 4 directions, and in each place a community that would outlast them. The disciples had not simply carried a message, they had embedded it in languages, in architecture, in the memory of nations that still exist today. But visibility has consequences. The wider Christianity spread, the more clearly Rome could see it. And Rome was not inclined to watch quietly for long. The Romans did not persecute Christians because they found the theology threatening. They persecuted them because Christians refused to perform a civic duty. In the Roman world, honoring the imperial gods, and eventually the emperor himself, was not considered religion in the modern sense. It was loyalty made visible. Soldiers did it, merchants did it, provincial governors did it. Refusal was not interpreted as personal belief. It was interpreted as sedition. Christians refused. That refusal created a social friction that accumulated quietly for decades before it ignited. The historian Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, recorded that Christians in Rome were already widely despised before Nero's persecution, accused, in his words, of hatred toward the human race. The charge almost certainly reflects Roman anxieties about a group that withdrew from public religious life, met privately, and spread through the lower classes with unusual speed. Then, in July of 64 AD, a fire consumed a significant portion of the city. It burned for 6 days. Nero, facing rumors that he had ordered it himself, redirected suspicion toward the Christian community. What followed was not a formal legal campaign. It was a public spectacle. Tacitus records Christians being burned as torches, thrown to animals, and crucified. He notes with visible discomfort that even Romans who despised the sect found the cruelty excessive. That detail is the one that tends to go unexamined. Tacitus was not a Christian sympathizer. His record of revulsion is a Roman official acknowledging in writing that the state had overreached, and yet the movement did not contract. It expanded. Scholars of early Christianity have noted a pattern that Roman authorities never appeared to anticipate. Public execution created witnesses, and witnesses created converts. The theological concept of martyrdom, dying in testimony to belief, transformed state violence into a recruitment mechanism Rome had no framework to counter. The empire had eliminated leaders before. Movements had collapsed. This one did not follow the expected pattern. The remaining disciples were still out there, and each of them, tradition records, was about to be found. James was the first. That much is historically documented. The Acts of the Apostles records his execution directly. Killed by sword on the order of King Herod Agrippa, somewhere around 44 AD. It is one of the only apostolic deaths the New Testament confirms without ambiguity. No tradition attached, no legend required. A sentence, and he is gone. What follows James in the historical record is quieter, and in some ways more unsettling for that. Simon is listed in the Gospels with the epithet, the Zealot, a designation that almost certainly carried political weight in first-century Judea, where zealot factions actively resisted Roman occupation. How a revolutionary adjacent figure became a traveling missionary is a transition the sources never explain. Traditions place him variously in Persia, Egypt, and along the African coast. None of those accounts can be verified. All of them end in execution. Jude Thaddeus shares Armenian martyrdom traditions with Bartholomew, whose fate was covered earlier. The convergence of two separate disciples in the same region, in the same tradition, is either corroborating evidence or the natural tendency of devotional memory to cluster around places that already held meaning. James the Lesser, distinguished from James the Greater to avoid confusion, leaves almost no individual trace in the historical record. What survives are martyrdom accounts written well after his death, describing stoning or being thrown from a height. The details vary by source, the outcome does not. Taken individually, each account carries gaps. Taken together, they describe something harder to dismiss. A pattern of men scattered across 4 continents, all reaching the same end. Centuries of artists encoded these deaths in stone, paint, and stained glass. Cathedral dedications, feast days, and relic shrines spread across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Each one a physical anchor for a tradition that might otherwise have dissolved. Whether these men died precisely as tradition records is a question history cannot fully close. What history can confirm is that the early Christian world believed they did, and built enduring monuments to that belief. One by one, the names disappear, all except one, and his survival, when every other account ends in death, raises a question that the tradition never quite resolves. Every other story in this documentary ends the same way. John's does not. The Gospel of John refers to him obliquely as the beloved disciple, never named directly in that text, identified only through proximity to Jesus at critical moments. He is present at the Last Supper. He stands at the foot of the cross. He is the first to believe after the empty tomb. The gospel that bears his name circles him without quite making him visible, which is an unusual literary choice that scholars have debated for centuries. What the early church record does confirm is his presence in Ephesus, one of the most significant cities in the Roman world, a commercial and religious hub on the western coast of Asia Minor. Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century, states that John lived and taught there into old age, and that he knew people who had personally heard him speak. That chain of testimony is short enough to be meaningful. Tradition also places him on the island of Patmos, where the book of Revelation was composed, a text saturated with the imagery of imperial persecution, written in the coded language of a community under pressure. Whether John the Apostle and the John of Patmos are the same person remains one of the more quietly contested questions in New Testament scholarship. He is said to have survived an attempt on his life in Rome, reportedly thrown into boiling oil and emerging unharmed, according to Tertullian. The story is almost certainly legendary, but its preservation suggests the early church felt his survival required some form of extraordinary explanation. He died in Ephesus, of old age, in his own bed. In the context of everything that preceded it, that ending feels almost incomprehensible. Polycarp, one of the most important figures in 2nd century Christianity, claimed to have sat at John's feet. Through him, and others like him, the living memory of the apostolic generation was transferred, not through documents alone, but through direct relationship. When John died, that chain ended. The last person who had walked with Jesus was gone, and yet the movement he left behind was larger, more organized, and more geographically dispersed than at any point in its history. How a faith survives the loss of everyone who founded it is not a small question. By the end of the 3rd century AD, Christianity had communities in Britain, North Africa, Persia, and the Indian subcontinent. No central authority had organized that expansion. No empire had funded it. It had moved along trade routes, through households, across prison walls, carried by people whose names history mostly did not record. The 12 had started something they did not live to see completed. What replaced the apostolic generation was a new layer of structure. Bishops, councils, written doctrines. The church that emerged in the 2nd and 3rd centuries was more institutionally complex than anything the disciples had built. It had to be. The original witnesses were gone, and the communities they left behind needed frameworks that could survive without living memory at the center. That transition is where history and legend become most difficult to separate. Historians generally trust the broad outlines that these men traveled, preached, founded communities, and died under hostile conditions. The specific details of their deaths, the precise routes of their journeys, the words attributed to them in their final moments, those exist in a different category of evidence: devotional, preserved because they were needed, not necessarily because they were witnessed. And yet those stories did something that verified facts alone rarely accomplish. They gave the movement an identity built around sacrifice rather than victory, a theology in which death confirmed rather than disproved the message. That framing proved extraordinarily durable. The Roman Empire, the same empire that crucified their teacher, executed their leader upside down, and fed their members to crowds, eventually adopted the faith as its official religion. The reversal is so complete it can be difficult to absorb. 12 men from a remote province, fishermen, a tax collector, a revolutionary, several of them so obscure that the historical record preserves little beyond their names. Together they seeded a movement that outlasted every authority that tried to end it. Their individual stories remain unfinished, suspended between what records confirm and what tradition insists. Lost gospels, suppressed texts, and alternative accounts suggest that the version of early Christianity that survived was not the only version that existed. What was set aside and why is a question the historical record has not yet fully answered. 2,000 years later, the 12 remain exactly what they were at the beginning of this story. Familiar names attached to lives that are only partially visible, and perhaps that incompleteness is not a failure of the historical record. Perhaps it is the most honest thing the record has left us.